Welcome to Broomhall House, the family home of the Bruce family in Scotland. House has been here for over 300 years. We decided to open the house for private tours in 2017. The house is full of really interesting artefacts which explain very clearly the history of Scotland and also how Scotland has influenced the wider world. This is the library of Broomhall House. This part of the house was added in 1798, which makes it virtually contemporary with the White House in Washington, D.C. The early libraries in the United States, like the library collected by Jefferson, was full of books written by Scottish thinkers, original thinkers and philosophers, writing in the second half of the 18th century based in Edinburgh and Glasgow. We're very fortunate that our archive contains manuscript material of great international significance. What I have here is an entire dispatch box of correspondence with Winston Churchill. In fact, there's almost 2 years' worth of letters written by Winston Churchill to my great-grandfather, who appears here in this picture. The family has had a long involvement in the 19th century, serving the governments of Queen Victoria with great distinction. This figurine of the Queen was given to my great-grandfather expressly so that he would take her silver effigy to India, and when he was entertaining Indian princes and maharajas around his dining table, they all had a very close connection physically to the Queen. And this is an entire box of letters written by Queen Victoria to my great-grandmother. This is another member of the family who served as a diplomat all over the world. In 1865, he was appointed as British Minister to Washington. And in fact, I've come across archives from the presidency of Lincoln, which indicates that Lincoln was attending a cabinet meeting, and the last piece of business at the meeting was for him to have taken the speeches of Frederick Bruce and to read them overnight before meeting him the next day. Sadly, that evening, Lincoln went to the theatre, and so he never actually had his meeting with Frederick the following day. The Old Master paintings in the collection were mostly acquired in Paris at the beginning of the 19th century. And the story of this picture is interesting because this lady epitomized female beauty in very much in a patriarchal world. The King of England, Henry VII, sent an ambassador to Naples to check her out. He had a list of questions that the king wanted answered, including the state of her teeth and how long was her neck. And I think the painter has deliberately exaggerated the length of her neck, almost to the extent of going overboard. When the tomb of King Robert the Bruce was discovered, it was such an important moment in Scottish history, almost like the discovery of Tutankhamun, that they made a mould of the king's skull, which is here. The skull is covered in scars of battle, and we have here his double-handed sword. Whether he used this sword in battle we're unsure. We believe that his favourite weapon was an axe. You might be interested to know that the contents of this house explain Scottish history, the history of Great Britain and the British Empire, and even world history. All these items are normally brought in during the course of a tour for your entertainment and edification. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to Broomhall House. I hope you enjoyed the introductory video, which was filmed 2 weeks ago on a very bright, very sunny day. I'm sitting in the dining room, which was the last room the camera came to, in front of a roaring log fire, because I can assure you the temperature is very different. This is a very cold January evening, and it's the night before Burns Night, which happens on the 25th of January. So we're all getting geared up for that very important Scottish celebration. And I hope very much to be able to be seeing you later on in the year when you come to Britain on the cruise ship of your choice.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. We've now got some questions from our viewers. I'll go to the first question now from Jane. She's in Maple Grove in the United States. And Jane says, I think you mentioned that the house has been there for over 300 years. Can you tell us when it was built and who was your ancestor who built it?
Well, we believe the first house was built in 1702, and it's been rebuilt on at least 2 occasions since. So we don't really have a very accurate understanding of what the first house looked like. All we know is that it was built from local materials, from local sandstone that was quarried here. It was probably a 4-story house, and it probably had wings adjoining for stabling and for a kitchen block. And the house was completely remodeled in 1766 by a very famous Scottish family of architects, the Adam family. And it was entirely rebuilt and looked very polished and very refined, only to be rebuilt again 30 years later at the end of the 18th century, in about 1796 to 1798, which makes it contemporary with the White House in Washington, D.C., which was built at that time as a forerunner of the Greek Revival movement. So a very polished neoclassical house. And we've stuck with it ever since. We haven't rebuilt it again. And it's known as a Palladian style of house because it reflects the proportions of the rooms. And it's just a very nice place to live, and a great privilege to be able to share it with our guests.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Kyle in Kent in the United States. And he says, I believe Broomhall House is still your family home. It must be incredible to be surrounded by so many historic artifacts. Have you categorized all of the items, and are there still more to be found and researched?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the catalogue runs to 137 Excel pages in different categories. But I do still find items, particularly when I open our archive to researchers who have come with a particular requirement for what they want to find. And the most recent discovery was a letter written the day after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Washington in 1865 by my great uncle, who was the British ambassador to Washington, writing to his family, and particularly his sister, explaining what had happened. And in fact, I was able to use that, introduce that in the introduction to this session this afternoon.
Thank you. I think you've just touched on this, but we have a question here from Vincent in Norwich in the United States. And he says, you draw an interesting parallel with the architecture of the White House, and I can see the similarity. Can you tell us what your connection is, or is there any connection with US presidents and the former owners of Broomhall?
Well, to my knowledge, no US president has visited this house, although my parents once entertained Mr. and Mrs. Reagan at a fantastic banquet in Scotland shortly after he retired. I think really the main connection is that the White House was built by Scottish masons. I don't know if that's widely known. I think the architect was French and it was based on an Irish house in Dublin, Leinster House, but the masons came from Scotland. And when the White House was built, we had opened our own quarries on this estate, and we processed building mortar. So the masons took the building mortar from our estate in Scotland to build the White House and used it to produce the lime wash, the paint, to cover the building over after it was finished. And I'm very ashamed to acknowledge that in the War of 1812, it was a party of Scottish soldiers who accidentally set alight to the building. So unfortunately, we built it, and we potentially destroyed it too.
Thank you. Question now from Lexi in Goldsborough, and she says, it's wonderful that the house can now be visited. Why did you decide to open the door for tours?
Well, that's a very good question. Most houses like this, whether castles or mansions, are open for public to view in Scotland. It's just prohibitively expensive to live in such a house purely as a family home without being able to generate additional revenue. We had the opportunity to refurbish the house in about 2016, 2017, And I took the opportunity then to envisage how it was going to be opened, and decided that we would do really private tours on the basis of that fitted more usefully with the way in which the house was lived in still.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is from Raymond in Miami, Florida, and he says, can you tell us a bit more about that huge collection of books in your library? Have you read many of them?
Well, you might be surprised to know that many of the books are still in print. And they're still widely read. I mean, we have 3 shelves of Walter Scott's novels from the first Waverley novels, which were published without acknowledging him as a writer. And we have books by other romantic writers from that period that are all still in print. I think the important point is that the library represents when, if you like, knowledge becomes understanding. That's the really important moment the library represents. And in the case of Scotland, it happens in the second half of the 18th century, in a period known as the Scottish Enlightenment. But the really interesting connection I think I was trying to get across in the video is that Scottish writers from that period, writers like Adam Smith, who wrote the Inquiry into the Cause of the Wealth of Nations, were widely read in the United States and collected. And we know that when Jefferson gave his library to Congress, exactly what was in it. And many of the contemporary philosophers that he was reading and wanted his contemporaries to read were Scottish, and their books had been published in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and they're in our library. And so if you like, it's an intellectual connection which is so fascinating, that connects Scotland from that period with the very beginning of the United States as the new republic.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question comes from Eva in Rancho Mirage in the United States, and she says, you showed us briefly a letter from Queen Victoria. Can you explain the connection between her and your family, and could you also tell us what she might have been writing to your ancestor about?
Well, Queen Victoria reigned for such a long time that there are many families like mine that would have known, several generations would have known her. And certainly my great-great-grandmother was a playmate of hers. I mean, they would have seen something of each other as children. And that was a very strong link. The letters I showed you were actually from my great-grandmother. So it's her daughter-in-law, continuing that connection with Queen Victoria almost to the end of the 19th century. And what actually they represent is that the British Empire was based on, if you like, appointments made directly by the Queen. So Queen Victoria was very actively involved, almost in an executive sense, like a US president, in making appointments and ensuring that people that had been appointed met with her approval and were doing what she wanted. And so just to make sure, she would endlessly be writing to them. So my great-grandparents went to India to represent her as Viceroy and Viceroy, and regularly would receive letters from her every week, although I'm not sure it was strictly necessary. She just felt that she had to have that personal connection. And she enjoyed writing letters, I think. I mean, she probably wrote for 2 or 3 hours a day. Letters which really didn't seem to have much consequence, but still it was important to know that she had a direct contact, direct connection.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question about letters. This one is from Vera in Shelter Island, New York. And she says, can you tell us about your great-grandfather who you mentioned was in touch with Winston Churchill?
Yes, it's a very curious story. My great-grandfather had served as Viceroy of India. He was a Liberal politician and returned to Britain in about 1900, so the beginning of the century, and probably was looking to a life where he would gradually begin to retire and take his ease. But within 6 years, the Liberal Party was re-elected, and he was talked about as being a future Foreign Secretary in the new cabinet. In the end, he took a different portfolio. He became Secretary of State for the colonies. And as Britain at that time controlled about 1/5 of the world's population and surface area, it was a huge responsibility. And the junior minister who entered his department at that time was Winston Churchill. And I think those of you who follow Winston Churchill's career, he changed party twice. He went from being Conservative to Liberal, then back to Conservative again. So at this particular moment, he was a Liberal and he was a junior minister. And it was a very interesting relationship. There was about 30 years of age difference between them. And my great-grandfather was very taciturn and very reflective, quite stern, and Churchill was very ebullient. And what I have found is the handover notes my great-grandfather gave to his successor, and he gave a thumbnail sketch of everyone in the department, except the description he gave for Churchill ran for several pages. And it's absolutely fascinating watching that he was in this position to watch or have some view on how Churchill would emerge as a statesman. And the correspondence that we have here represents about 2 years worth of letters. I think there are about 27 letters between them.
Wonderful, thank you. A question now from Craig in San Francisco, and he says, how is Broomhall run today? It must be quite a job to look after all those precious artefacts and maintain the house.
Well, we try and ensure that the artifacts are kept to what you might call museum conditions of conservation. All the windows, south-facing windows, have a film, an ultraviolet filter on them, because light actually is the most damaging thing that can happen to old things, whether they're rugs, carpets, or book bindings. Other than that, the house is kept very clean and free of dust. And my sister and I attend conservation courses. We endlessly have curators from the National Collections to come and look at our items here, whether they're paintings or ceramics or books, and get a very good understanding of the most up-to-date conservation techniques that you should be applying. But ultimately, most things are put away. They're not left out in the light unless it's strictly necessary. So when I have a tour, I will bring certain objects out to give me sort of stepping stones of memory and to make the tour more interesting. And then afterwards, I'll put them away because invariably they're light sensitive. So I think when people come on the tour, they have a sense that a lot of material is laid out for them to see, but it's usually that material is kept in an archive and kept out of the light and only kind of brought out when it's necessary.
Wonderful, thank you. A comment now from one of our viewers. His name is Robert Bruce and he's in Norfolk in the United States. He says, I descend from George Bruce, who was in the northern neck of Virginia and did a deposition in 1670 when he was 20 years old. He says he hasn't been able to find which Bruce family in Scotland he came from, or when or which ship he immigrated to Virginia on. And then Robert's also asking, can you comment on the last home of Robert the Bruce being in Renton and about the authenticity of the Bruce Museum there?
Well, I think your question was in two parts. I strongly recommend that you join our family association in North America, Family of Bruce International, FOBI. We have a lot of Bruce kinsmen in your neck of the woods, in Virginia and in the Carolinas and Texas. In fact, I went to Williamsburg and opened the Highland Games there in 2011, I think it was. I met a lot of them then. So you would be surprised to find a lot of kindred spirits in your part of the United States. And they'll be delighted if you wanted to volunteer and help them go from game gathering to gathering in the season. And you'd really enjoy that. I think the other question you had about Robert the Bruce's final home, it is true, he didn't die in a castle or in battle. He died in his bed in a very comfortable manor house, which he built for himself towards the end of his life in what is now West Dunbartonshire near Helensburgh, on a bow of the River Leven. And it must have been a rather beautiful place with abundance of wildlife, which would have given him a very good diet. He would have had salmon in the River Leven. He would have kept a boat on the Clyde. And he would have had hunting nearby for venison. So he would have had his larder was well stocked. And we know that an archaeological study has been done to show the location of the manor he built for himself, although obviously it wasn't built in stone, it was built of timber. so nothing has survived. And there is a very interesting museum set up in the nearby village of Renton, which records all the archaeological material that's been found. And I think there's a lot of truth behind this, because he was always fearful that Scotland would be invaded again, and he may have needed a bolt hole to escape to the west. And if you remember, at the beginning of his reign, he escaped the mainland, and we think he went to Rathlin Island off Antrim. And I think that was always a possibility, that he may have needed to have kept that escape route open towards the end of his life, and that's why he chose to live where he did. So well done in asking that question. It's a really fascinating story. I hope you come back to Scotland and go and see the Strathleven artisans at Renton, who have done all this archaeological survey.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We've got lots of questions coming in from a few different people. We've got Howard, Richard and Lucy. They'd all like to ask about the tartan hanging behind you. Is this the Bruce tartan? Could you tell us a bit about it?
It's actually a coat. It's on a tailor's dummy. It's a jacket and a waistcoat dating from 1784, which was the year that the banning of tartan was lifted, the prescription of tartan, which was introduced after the Jacobite Rebellion in 1746, because tartan was seen as a symbol of dissent. And when the prescription was lifted, people rushed out and had new tartan made up, and this was one of them. And the man who had it made up was a kinsman. He was called James Bruce of Kinnaird, and he had actually, in the previous decade, had left Scotland on a 14-year grand tour, which took him to Africa, and he discovered the source of the Blue Nile, at least he alleged he did, and wrote up his travel story in 5 volumes. And so when he came to invent the tartan, he used, I think, the background of an existing tartan and laid onto it as a sort of palimpsest additional colors, including cerise, cherry, and turquoise. And so the tartan has a turquoise line running across it, a turquoise check, which represents the discovery of the River Nile, the world's longest river. And it's sort of quite remarkable. There should be a kind of geographic story literally entwined in this tartan, but that's the case. And tragically for us as a family, we discovered that about 30 years ago, a famous dress designer, someone called Vivienne Westwood, decided that she wanted to produce an entire haute couture range in this tartan. There was absolutely nothing we could have done about it. And so the window of her shop window in London was full of models with slashed miniskirts, all wearing our beautiful Bruce of Kinnaird tartan, because it's such a bright and has such a bright and colourful appearance.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Our next question is from Bridget in San Diego, and she says, to start with, thank you for sharing your home with us. And then I was wondering if most Scots actually do celebrate Burns Night, and do you? And what is the ode to the haggis? And is haggis a meatball?
I answer it sort of back to front. Haggis is, it really contains offal. That's why it's quite difficult possibly to get the ingredients right sometimes. I think you have to imagine that it was a dish that would have been made of all the kind of sweepings off the floor from a slaughterhouse. So the least refined dish you can possibly imagine. And the whole point of the ode that Burns wrote to the haggis in 1786 was a joke. It was to venerate something very basic and very ordinary into being of equal status with the most refined cuisine of other European countries, such as France and Italy. So it's a bit of a kind of joke in that sense. But it actually is very nutritious. I mean, you probably shouldn't eat too much of it, but it's very good to have it at least once a year on the 25th of January, which is Burns's birthday. And it's widely celebrated in Scotland, but more importantly, it's celebrated to connect the disparate kinship networks of Scots all over the world. And we believe that our diaspora is anywhere between 30 and 50 million people. It must be one of the world's largest diasporas. And Burns Night is one of the really key moments of the year when people can get together and celebrate. I mean, one of the biggest Burns clubs in the world is in Chicago. I think it's the Burns Club of Illinois. I mean, every American city, every city in the United States will have its own Burns Club. And whether they're allowed to meet at the moment because of COVID, I'm not sure, but they'll probably have it virtually instead and sing the songs and declaim the poetry that he wrote.
Wonderful, thank you. A question from Jessica in the United States, and she says, do you still hold ceilidhs and do you dance?
We certainly dance. I haven't held a ceilidh in the house for a while. I probably should do. When I was younger, I used to go to Highland balls a lot, and the best memory I had was going to a ball in Oban and crossing from Mull, where we had dined that evening on a fishing boat. And at that time, I used to play the bagpipes, and I played the pipes in the bow of the fishing boat as it came into the harbour. And then we all marched up to the ballroom after that. It was the most wonderful evening. So I have very fond memories of dancing Scottish reels in lots of different places. And it's a tradition which I hope my children will carry on too.
Wonderful, thank you. That actually leads into a question from Theodora in Miami, and she says, mentioning the discussion of ancestral relations, who is the future generation to care for Broomhall House?
Well, my parents are still very much alive and living in the house, so I see myself as the future generation at the moment, because I feel I'm sufficiently young enough to be able to take on these responsibilities, but I have 5 children. So I feel that it's at some point I'm going to be in a good position to be planning well into the future and to ensure that the house is looked after as well as it is at the moment. I mean, what we're trying to do is to establish a business use that's compatible with it continuing to be a family home. So it shouldn't be too much of a burden for anyone, and it should be an enjoyable experience, particularly meeting many visitors from all over the world and giving them a tour of the house. It's actually a very enjoyable experience. And I hope very much that my children will share that.
Wonderful, thank you. We've had a couple of questions now about the beautiful fireplace behind you. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that. And one of our regular viewers, Miki, she notices whether the tiles that we can see behind you are the Dutch Delft.
Yes, I'm afraid the fireplace is a bit of a trompe-l'oeil, it's a trick. A lot of things in this house are quite tricky. And the fireplace is really made from pieces of a 4-poster bed, or at least that's what we believe, which is made from oak and walnut. And we think it was made in Germany in the 16th century. It certainly came to Scotland in 1587 on the marriage of James VI and his Danish bride, Anne of Denmark. It came in her her trousseau. And it has a constitutional history because the Stuarts were born on the bed. James VI, 3 children. He became King of Great Britain in 1603 when Elizabeth died and established his own Scottish dynasty on, if you look, for the first time on the English throne. So to that extent, the bed has some historical significance because both the Stuart line and the Hanoverian line date from their marriage. The Stuarts under Charles I and the Hanoverians descend from James's daughter Elizabeth, who married the King of Bohemia. So I am able to tell a very interesting constitutional story of why the fireplace is so important. And you're absolutely right. There are blue and white Delft tiles. It was made up into a fireplace in the 19th century, I think in the 1890s, and my great-grandmother chose the tiles for it.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Question here from Richard in Chagrin Falls in the United States, and he says, with the coming of the movie Braveheart, many in the world were first introduced to the relationship between Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. Are there artefacts or writings between the two of them in Broomhall House?
Well, no. Sadly, we have very few artifacts that connect us to King Robert because the family virtually disappeared during his reign. His brothers were all died pretty horrific, violent deaths. And we're descended from his brother Edward, who was killed in Ireland. His own line died out with his son David II, although David did give us land and possessions. So we have a charter dating from that period, but precious little else. You can find in the archives in Edinburgh, the National Archives, and a lot of places in Scotland like Haddington and Aberdeen will have a charter from the king signed by him. So there is evidence of archives dating from his reign in different public collections in Scotland. They're not difficult to find. Is there correspondence between him and William Wallace? I think you may find some documents that they both signed at the same time as Guardians of Scotland. Beyond that, there's a great deal of mythology, I think, has emerged from the relationship between them, which has been obviously of great interest for writers of historical fiction. But I think the important point is that it's very unusual for any European country to have had two outstanding heroic figures almost at the same time. And the Scottish Wars of Independence represent very much the different styles of leadership that both of them represented, and they're very different. And for some surprising reasons, it's thought that Wallace was more of a warrior figure than King Robert, but I would dispute that. And I think King Robert's legacy as a guerrilla leader and a tactician maybe put him in a slightly higher category than Wallace. And the most surprising thing of all that people don't recognize often is that King Robert would have placed in his own imagination Edward I as the military leader that he most wanted to emulate than William Wallace, because he represented, if you like, the enormity of the military challenge that he faced with the constant threat of an English army arriving in Scotland.
Wonderful, thank you. A question here now from Robert in Salt Lake City, and he says, does your family have any connections to the great Scottish scientists of the 18th and 19th centuries?
Yes, actually, although I would go further back to the 17th century. And one of my ancestors was a founder member of the Royal Society and is credited as being an inventor of some note. A guy called Alexander Bruce, who would have gone to Holland, to the Low Countries in the 1650s after the English Civil War. He married took a Dutch wife, and there he collaborated with a Dutch mathematician called Christian Huygens, and they developed the world's first seagoing chronometer, a pendulum clock, in order to improve navigation of particular ships crossing the Atlantic. So, I mean, from the family's perspective, we have that as a kind of feather in our cap, and then we can go back another 100 years to the 16th century, and another member of the family pioneered the deep mining of coal, which actually was the basis of the family's prosperity from the 1570s. So I think as a short answer to your question, yes, we do have connections with scientific endeavour in Scotland, and invariably it was really to do with improving productivity. There was usually a very practical outcome for scientific inquiry. It wasn't such an abstract sort of study as you might have thought. People had a very specific need, usually to improve the productivity of the land so they didn't starve and wouldn't face the crisis of crop failure every year.
Excellent, thank you. Question here from Alison in Niceville in the United States, and she says, we saw a piano in the video. Is this piano playable, and do you ever host concerts in Broomhall House?
Well, actually, we have two grand pianos, and I can't remember which one appeared in the video. We have two pianos made by the Scottish piano maker Broadwood, and one was a wedding present and would have arrived in the house in about 1847. And we believe it was played by Frederick Chopin when he came to Scotland the following year. So that's actually quite a remarkable, it's quite a remarkable musical history. And the other but unfortunately it doesn't keep very good tune. So we have a smaller grand piano dating, I think, from about 1910, and that is kept in good tune, and that can be used for concerts. And the house has actually very good natural acoustics because of the plasterwork. So if we do have concerts here, it does sound very good.
Wonderful, thank you. A question here from Sandra in Greenville, and she says, I'm from the Irvine clan, and I've read that we're connected to Sir Robert the Bruce from Drum Castle in Aberdeenshire. Do you have any information on that possible connection?
Yes, it's perfectly possible. I'm just racking my brains about Drum Castle. It may have been a charter which Robert gave. That part of Scotland was very contentious during the time of his reign, because it was the stronghold of his deadly rivals, the Cummin family. So it's perfectly possible that your family, he brought them round and they joined his camp, so to speak, and he may have given them a charter. That may be what you have in your family collection.
Thank you. And another question here from James in Arlington. He says, do you know if there's any Viking blood going way back into the Bruce family history?
Yes, I mean, we are Viking, or Viking stock. The Vikings had a very successful maritime empire, which connected up coastlines all over Europe. They traveled widely as you know, in boats that were designed to run up river systems because they had a retractable keel. And so they dominated the east coast of Scotland for several centuries. We believe that our family actually settled in northern France, in what is now Normandy, as Norsemen, and became, if you like, domesticated and started to farm rather than to travel as seagoing warriors. But they never lost their fighting spirit. And that's the reason really why the Norman conquest was such a success, or the last time that Britain was conquered, because they clearly defeated the Anglo-Saxons in battle. And I don't think they ever kind of lost that fighting prowess, which they probably could trace very much to the time when they were Norsemen.
Wonderful, thank you. A quick question here from Federica in San Diego, and she says, did you ever have a Scottish accent?
I was sent to an English school, so if I did, I lost all trace of it. I do apologise if you feel let down or disappointed in any way.
Thank you. A question here from Susan in Stonington, and she asks, are there any ghosts in Broomhall?
Well, I've yet to see one. It is true that some places in Scotland are very famously or infamously haunted. People are desperate to get a sighting of the ghost, but there's never been a ghost sighted here. I know that for a fact that over 70 children have been born and brought up in this house. So it's been a very family-centric place. We once had a visit of a medium, a spiritual medium. My grandparents had attended an event in Edinburgh in the 1920s at Holyrood, the Palace of Holyrood House, which sits at the bottom of the Royal Mile, which is possibly the most haunted place in Scotland. And they discovered a lady sitting in the hall of this palace, looking ashen as white as a sheet. And so my grandmother approached her, and it turned out to be the wife of the Prime Minister, a lady called Mrs. Baldwin. And she explained that her husband had been taken ill and was upstairs in a bedroom. And she was absolutely terrified because she had the sense of what an evil place it was. So my grandmother said, oh, I'm sure he'll be fine. The king's doctor will look after him. Why don't you come home with us and we'll make it give you a comfortable stay. So she came back to Broomhall, and when she came into the house, she sat down immediately in the first chair she could find with a sigh of relief and said, I feel so comfortable here. This place has such a wonderful, warm and welcoming spirit. So I hope very much that all our guests have the same feeling when they come here.
Wonderful, thank you. And could you, Mel, tell us about the connection between Broomhall House and the storyline of the Downton Abbey movie?
Well, this is really came about because one of my cousins is the historical advisor to Downton. In fact, he's been involved in all the episodes and the film. And he occasionally rings my father or my parents to get their endorsement on some historical point of etiquette. And I think what actually happened was that the plot of the film is based on a royal visit, and it's an absolute coincidence, but we actually had a royal visit here in 1923 from King George V and Queen Mary, and that was the plot which ran for the Downton movie, although they didn't stay the night and didn't get up to any high jinks. But in fact, I've got a photograph here which shows the party after lunch, that you can see it, of the King and Queen, and also contains the Duke of York, who became George VI, the king of the film The King's Speech, and the Duchess of York, who became the Queen Mother. So in fact, there were 4 members of the royal family. And also in the front row on the far left is the widow of Andrew Carnegie, the philanthropist, who was also local to this part of the world. And there are 2 children in the photograph, and it was taken in 1923, and they're both still alive, my aunties. One is 100 and one is 98. So this is still a picture which has some currency.
Wow, that's very incredible. Thank you so much. We've got lots of comments thanking you very kindly for showing us into your home. And just to finish off, a couple of questions that have come in from people. Could you just remind us exactly where Broomhall is located and when Viking guests might be able to come and visit on one of your tours?
Well, the house is conveniently situated for any cruise ships landing in Scotland. It's only literally 5 minutes from Rosyth. And it's about 25 minutes from Newhaven, Leith, where they come in Edinburgh. So it's actually very close. I've already got provisional bookings for all the Viking cruises. That's something like 13 or 14 of them on 3 different ships. So they're in my diary, and all I can suggest is you sign up. So you come on the excursion that will bring you here, and then I know that the inquiries will become firm bookings. But the tours are going ahead anyway. I've got, I think, 50 or 60 tours booked this year. Although I haven't given any tours for 2 years, I'd be absolutely delighted to start taking proper guided tours around the house and the collection again, and look forward to seeing you.